everybody, thanks for tuning into Gringier Cycles. I'm Joel. If you're new to the channel, Gringier Cycles is an online bike shop that specializes in vintage mountain and road bikes, especially from the 80s and 90s, and we really emphasize on mountain bikes. Because I sell parts and bikes and frames online, I get a lot of technical questions that I have to try to explain to customers either over the phone or email. And luckily, with modern technology, we can do video calls. But I thought today I would answer 9 of the most frequent technical questions that I get asked. So I already did a video on BCD, which is by far the most common question I get asked. So there'll be a link to that video right here if you want to check it out. That's kind of a slightly more complex conversation, so I have a whole video just for that. But let's get into the other questions. Okay, so I made myself a little list so I wouldn't forget what I wanted to talk about. And first, we're going to start off by talking about headsets, and especially about 1-inch headsets and crown race compatibility. So the crown race is the part of your headset that gets pressed onto your fork, onto the steer. Now with 1-inch steers, there's 2 common sizes of crown race seating diameter that we're going to run into. And so that is the diameter of the steer tube at the base where the crown race is going to seat. So a caliper, it's a very handy tool to have in your toolbox. If you don't have one, you'll want to measure that size. So this one is 26.4. So there's 2 sizes. There's 26.4 and there's 27. 26.4 is the more common size on higher end bikes, and 27.0 you're going to find that more frequently on lower end bikes, especially from Asia. So the reason this is important is because if you are ordering a headset for your bike and you get the wrong crown race size, the crown race won't fit. And then you'll need to track down a very similar crown race that is in the right diameter to fit, and that can lead to problems. So it is best when ordering a headset to make sure that you measure the diameter of your crown race seat first before you order a headset. I try to make sure to list all the diameters of the crown races on all the 1-inch headsets we sell in the shop. So that way, if you know your measurement, you can look in the description and you'll see that this is a 26.4 or this is a 27-inch. So measuring crown race seat and diameter with a caliper so you get the right headset. Next, we're going to do hub space, and again, we're going to need our handy dandy caliper. So rear hubs are really where it's at. Front hubs for 99% of vintage mountain and road bikes are going to be 100 millimeters, but the rear hubs are going to come in 3 different sizes that in the area of bikes that we deal with you're going to run into. The most common is 135. The way you measure this is from outside to outside of where the hub would sit in the frame. So you'll see this one is 135. So if you have a hub and you're looking for a frame, you can measure the hub. If we have a frame, you'd be measuring right here where the hub would touch. So inside to inside on a frame, outside to outside on a hub. So again, we have 135. 135 is going to be most of our 8-speed and up mountain bikes, and 130 is going to be what you're going to find on 7-speed and older mountain bikes. Road bikes you will find at 126 for 5 and 6 speed, and then they'll jump to 130, which was the standard until we went to disc brakes. Now, cold setting is the act of expanding dropouts to fit a different hub. My rule of thumb is you can go up one size. So if your bike was 126, you could go to 130. If your bike was 130, you could go to 135. It doesn't happen as frequently, but sometimes people want to go down a size. So again, you can go down one size. I have a video where I do this, so I'll link that here so you can check that out more in depth. But measuring and ordering the right hubs or wheel set, again, is a little thing you want to make sure you do before you place an order for an item like that. Okay, now we're going to talk about bottom brackets. So the first piece of information to measure when you're trying to figure out what bottom bracket you need is the width of the bottom bracket shell. So again, our handy dandy caliper is going to come in handy. For most mountain bikes, we're going to be at 68 millimeters, which this one is. Most road bikes are going to be 73 millimeters. Now there is one other size the shell could be that is fairly common, and that is 70 millimeters. And that is a giveaway that it is an Italian bottom bracket threading. Because, again, as is, there's different widths of the bottom bracket shell. There's different actual threads on the internal threads of bottom bracket shells. There is English, which is the most common, which you'll see stamped on the bottom bracket as 1.37 times 24. That is an English or a British ISO bottom bracket, and that is going to be the most common for mountain bikes and road bikes that aren't Italian. If the bike is Italian, it's going to have a 70 mil width bottom bracket shell, and it's going to be running a 36 millimeter by 1 bottom bracket. And so the threads are going to be different. So by measuring the width of the shell, that'll pinpoint if it is Italian or if it is ISO/English. Now, there is other sizes. There's French, and the French is a 68 millimeter shell, but it's 35 millimeters by 1, and weirdly, it is right hand thread and right hand thread, where British or English threaded bottom bracket is left, so counterclockwise on the right side of the bike, the drive side of the bike, and it is right or clockwise on the left side of the bike. So that is another way you can check for what you have. But on most vintage mountain bikes, if it's a threaded bottom bracket, it is going to be a standard ISO English threaded bottom bracket. But if you're dabbling in the road bikes, it gets a little bit more confusing. Obviously the brand of the bike. If it is a French bike, it's going to have a French bottom bracket. If it's an Italian bike, it's most likely going to have an Italian bottom bracket. Some Italian bikes were made with English bottom brackets, so if the bike has Durace on it, more likely that it might have an English bottom bracket instead of a French bottom bracket. But measuring and checking that will help you get the right bottom bracket. Now the next question that gets asked a lot is about SRAM and Shimano compatibility. And this is probably a question everybody's pondered and wondered about. And kind of the easy way to think about it is I kind of break it into two groups, chains and cassettes. 8, 9, and 10 speed, SRAM and Shimano, cassettes and chains are the same. So in the vintage mountain bike world and in the vintage road bike world where we're dealing with 8 and 9 speed, you could run a whole Shimano drivetrain and run a SRAM chain or a SRAM cassette, vice versa. Now I personally prefer the SRAM chains over the Shimano chains for 8 speed and 9 speed. So pretty much every bike I build runs a SRAM 8-speed chain or 9-speed chain, depending on the drivetrain. So chains and cassettes, cross-compatible between the two. Pull ratios. So this is the pull of the shifter, SRAM versus Shimano. They use different pull ratios. So you cannot run a Shimano shifter on a SRAM rear derailleur. But SRAM makes shifters that will shift Shimano rear derailleurs. Shimano doesn't do anything. Shimano's over here by itself doing its thing. SRAM's over here doing its thing, but in the middle, there's a group of SRAM shifters that will shift Shimano rear derailleurs. And they actually make it easy to tell the difference. If it is a SRAM shifter and it's like an X9 or an XO or an X5, that is SRAM pull ratios. If it is SRAM attack or a different name like Rocket, those shifters are the ones that work with Shimano rear derailleurs. So there's a lot of like SRAM grip shifters that are Shimano compatible, but there's no Shimano shifter that'll work with SRAM rear derailleurs. Now, there's different gadgets you can use to try to manipulate the pull ratios, and some of that's doable, but it can get confusing. It may not work very crisp. Now, if you're like me and you build up 90% of your bikes with friction shifters, you can really do whatever you want as long as you have enough throw in the shifter. And I build most of my bikes to be 8 or 9 speed, so I don't ever have an issue with throw. And I've built plenty of bikes with friction shifters that are 10 speed, and you don't have any issue with throw. So if you want to keep your bike simple and you want to dabble with different cassette ranges in the back and gearings, going friction shifters is a really easy way to not have to worry about pull ratios. Next, we're going to talk about shims. I get a lot of questions about shims. People are like, I love that seat post, but it's not the right size for my bike, or I love this bar and it's not the right size for my bike. And I have no issue with shims. Cane Creek makes lots of really nice seat post shims. They're nice and long, and they have a lip on them so that they can go deep into your frame, and they get held in by the friction, and they have the slit in the back, so obviously when you tighten the collar, they tighten, holds your seat in. Handlebar shims, there's different sizes of handlebars, which is actually on my list to talk about. 25.4 is the most common mountain bike size, and there's 26.0, which is road, and 26.4, which is Chinelli, and there's 31.8, which is modern. There's also 22.2, which is like BMX standard. So a lot of people will run a BMX bar and shim it up to 25.4 so they can run a standard mountain stem. Now, I'm all for running shims, handlebar and seat post, except if the bike is going to get ridden super hard off-road. Because the more shims you add, the more things that could go wrong. Now, I'm not so much worried about seat post shims, but handlebar shims, you may not be able to clamp the bars tight, so if you're really riding off-road hard, you could get the bar to slip, which could then lead to you going over the bars. So in that instance, I would recommend a customer to not run a handlebar shim, and also we can talk about adapters in this conversation, Quill adapters. You can get, if you have a 1-inch threaded headset, you can run a Quill adapter, so you can run a threadless stem. And again, I would recommend that if you're just using it for around town or light off-road riding, those kind of adapters, there's nothing wrong with them. But if you're going to be doing hard off-road riding, if we can limit the adapters, that is best. So shims are good. They come in tons of different sizes for what you need, and we'll get talking more about seat posts, so that'll make sense here in a second. Handlebar sizes. As I mentioned, handlebar sizes, again, can be something to watch out for. I have made myself a handy dandy tool. I've cut apart 2 bars, a 25.4 and a 26. Some stems will say what size they are. If they do, a lot of times it's on the back of the quill, and it'll tell you what size handlebar they take. Normally it also tells you what size the quill is, which we're going to get to next, because guess what? There's multiple size quill stems. But in the world of handlebars, if you're in the vintage realm, there's three sizes you're going to run into the most. There's the BMX style, which is 22.2. There's mountain, and a lot of American and Japanese road, which is 25.4, and then Italian and other road brands that do 26, and then Chanelli is kind of off on its own, and it did 26.4 for a long time, and then switched to 26.0. So I use these cutout bars to measure the ones that I put up on the site. If you're trying to find out what size you need and it's not stamped on your stem, two options. If you have the bar you took out, measuring the bar is going to be easiest because that size does not change. Your quill, obviously, is going to get bigger when you loosen up the cinch bolt. So when you measure this, if it's 25.4, it might measure closer to 25.8 with your caliper. So you just got to keep, a one that is like worn out and maybe really expanded could measure 26, but obviously when it tightens down correctly, it's going to be 25.4. So normally you can also tell by measuring the bar, if you have the bar, is the easiest way to know. If you just have a stem, you'll just need to measure and kind of measure in a few different places to get the diameter. Which, like this one right now is 25.6. So the 26 one is going to be like 26.2 or 26.4, and the 25.4 is going to be like 25.6, 25.8. So that's how you measure handlebar size. So the next thing that gets asked a bunch is, will this quill stem fit my bike? And that's because there's three different sizes of quill stems. There's 1 inch, and this is another funny thing about the bike industry. We call it a 1 inch headset. That's because the outer diameter of the steer tube is 25.4, which is 1 inch. The inner diameter of that steer tube is going to be 22.2. So we measure the OD in inches. We measure the ID in metric. Confuses the shit out of me. I don't know why we do it. Why are we crossing the realms of measuring? Now there is a different size of 1 inch quill stem, and that is on older Schwinn's and clunkers and cheap bikes and BMX bikes. It's 21.1. So a 22.2 stem obviously won't fit in a 21.1. You would be able to put a 21.1 into a 22.2, but it's not going to tighten correctly, and there'll be a gap from where the fork goes in around the headset. So you want to make sure, and again, you'll be able to look at the bike and measure the inside of the steer tube. If you don't have the stem you pulled out, and it's a older, cheaper bike, you want to measure the ID of the steer tube. Or if you have the stem, you can measure the stem, because you'll want to order a stem that's going to fit on your bike. Now, there's also 1 inch, there's also 1 1/8 inch threaded headsets. So they take a 25.4 quill stem. So there's some confusion with people, because 25.4 is obviously 1 inch. But this will not fit in a 1 inch steer tube, because the inner diameter of a 1 inch steer tube is 22.2. This is for the ID of a 1 1/8 inch steer tube. So 1 1/8, we would call this a 1 1/8 inch quill stem, because it's a 25.4 quill. And then we have oversized. This is really common on Gary Fisher's, Alpine Stars, Yeti. They used 1 1/4 inch steer tube. So they need a 28.6 diameter quill stem. And again, this is another one where your handy dandy caliper A lot of these are going to have them stamped on the quill itself, but handy dandy caliper. Luckily for us, 22.2, 25.4, and 28.6 are far enough apart that it's easy to tell the difference even without a caliper once you get used to it. Sitting at a table, I can just tell what these are. You know, you can get a pretty good idea that they're getting bigger from right to left. So even if you don't have a caliper, pretty easy to know what's going on if you have them all in front of you. But just remember the 1 inch is going to be the most common, and that is going to be the slenderest, and that there is one other 1 inch, which is 21.1, and that's mostly going to be in BMX style stems. Okay, and then seat post sizes. Man, is this a dilemma and a pain in the butt. You've probably all dealt with this. Seat posts come in so many sizes. Pretty much every 0.2 millimeters, there's a different seat post size. So 27, 27.2, and there's 26.8, there's 26.6. And some brands will be consistent, and other brands every few years switch to a new size. And measuring this is like measuring the handlebar diameter, where when you loosen the clamp, it is going to expand the seat tube, and so it's going to make it harder to make a measurement. So you always want to measure the seat post you have in your bike if it is a good solid fit and you feel like it is correct. If not, you can use a caliper, but a really handy tool is seat post gauges. Now these metal ones are expensive, and I don't know if they're made anymore. They probably are, but you can 3D print plastic ones. My buddy did, and they are very accurate, and they're shaped like these, and they don't weigh 5 pounds. But these just start at 25.4 and go up and have all the different sizes you may run into. So a lot of times customers will ask, will this seat post work in my bike? Or I think my bike is a 27. And it's important to measure that correctly so that the seat post you're ordering fits. Or if you have a frame, that the seat post, vice versa. So caliper, I have a old school caliper. Digital calipers are really nice for this stuff. I like this dial indicator one just because it's what I've always used and I know how to read it, but a digital one is probably the easiest thing to read. So you'll notice with all these things we talked about, crown race, need a caliper. Hub spacing, need a caliper. You can measure it on a frame with a ruler. Bottom brackets, to get the width of the bottom bracket shell, we're going to need a caliper. Again, could be done with a tape measure, but it's going to be easier with a caliper. Chain and cassette, don't need really to measure anything, just need to know chains and cassettes are compatible. Pull ratios, nothing to measure, but again, you need to know what shifters you're using with what derailleurs. Shims, you're going to need a measure to know what shim you need. So again, you're going to need a caliper. Handlebar sizes, caliper. Quill stems, caliper. Seat post, caliper. So pretty much, if you're building a bike and you're building out your tools because you've never done it before, after Allen wrenches, a caliper may be the most important tool. Because we just talked about 9 different things and 7 of them need a caliper. And if you watch the video on BCD, which is bolt circle diameter, which is the size of chain rings, one of the ways to do that needs a caliper. So calipers are super important. There's a lot of things to know when you're building a bike, and it can seem daunting at first, but with proper measurements, a lot of those things become easy to understand. So hopefully all of that conversation on some technical aspects of bikes that are confusing is helpful when you're building your bike or looking at purchasing new parts for your bike. You should also know that I'm always here to help via phone, email, video call, whatever it takes to help you figure out what you need for your bike. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions on any products that we have listed up on the website. We have full bikes to the smallest little part you could need, so make sure to check it out. I'll put a link below. But like I said, if you do, or if you are on the website and have any questions, I'm here to help, and I enjoy talking to people about my passion, which is vintage bikes. So yes, hopefully this answered some questions. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.